Welcome to New Possibilities. I speak truth to power without fear. So this video right here is probably going to be the realest video I ever done before. It's going to be one of the most honest videos I've ever done, one of the most frank videos that I've done. And some people may not like this video, but I just want to make it clear at the beginning, put these disclaimers out here. You know, I believe that racism still has an impact on us today. Racism is a reality in America, obviously. You know, we are still affected by the continuing legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. So I don't deny that at all. I don't deny those problems. But recently, I've just been reflecting on the state of affairs in the city where I live, Baltimore City, and just on Black communities in general in the United States. And as I've reflected on this, I just thought about the question, how long are we going to sit back and blame the white man for our problems? And I'm going to tell you why this question came to mind is because as I look at the state of affairs in Baltimore, when I look at the violence that plagues Baltimore, you know, where over 300 people are murdered for the past 5 years, and it looks like Baltimore is probably going to exceed the record from last year. When I look at the failing schools in Baltimore, when I look at the poverty in Baltimore, when I look at the racial disparities in between Black and white communities, when we're talking about wealth, when I look at the open air drug markets that plague Baltimore City, where people are openly selling drugs and using drugs, and you see people on a regular basis in heroin or opiate-induced stupors, where they're nodding off to sleep while they're standing up. This is not uncommon. Anybody in Baltimore will tell you they've seen this before. This is the state of affairs in Baltimore, where you have failing schools where kids are graduating from high school without even knowing how to read, without even being able to do basic mathematics. This is the state of affairs in Baltimore. You have these horrible conditions. And as I look at these conditions, I ask myself again, how long can we blame white people for the conditions in Baltimore and other Black communities when Black people run these communities? In Baltimore City, you have a Black mayor. You have a Black city council president. You have a predominantly Black city council. You have a Black comptroller. Black people in higher positions throughout Baltimore city government. You have a Black CEO in charge of the schools in Baltimore. You have a Black police chief in Baltimore. But yet and still, you have all those problems that I mentioned before. All these election promises that all these candidates bring up every year, every election cycle, and yet and still the conditions in Baltimore are deplorable. You know, you have some communities where trash is everywhere in those communities. Like when I'm driving up Greenmount, after I've left downtown Baltimore, all I see is trash everywhere. And that trash is a symbol of the state of affairs in Baltimore, unfortunately. And we can no longer just sit back and blame white people for these conditions when Black people run the government, when Black people run most of the institutions in the government. Now, Black people don't run the financial institutions, unfortunately, but when it comes to the political apparatus, Black people run these things, but yet and still the conditions in Baltimore are deplorable. And this is part of the reason why a lot of people have lost hope in the electoral process. This is part of the reason why so few people actually turn out to these elections, because they don't see any difference in their lives. And when I look at this violence that's plaguing our community, you know, and obviously I understand the issue of police brutality and the issue of inner city violence are two separate issues. I did a video on my TikTok explaining this. But when you look at the over 300 people killed in the city of Baltimore, it's not the police killing those 300. It's not the KKK killing those 300. It's not the alt-right killing those 300. It's not the skinheads doing this. It's not some Republicans doing this. It's other young black men killing other young black men. That's the state of affairs. That's the condition that we see in Baltimore and other black communities. And what I'm saying about Baltimore applies to other communities as well, other cities as well, where black people hold office and they hold control over the political establishment, but yet and still the conditions are deplorable and despicable. The bottom line is this: we can no longer sit back and just blame other people for our problems. We have to take control over our own destiny. I heard a quote like several years ago that talked about how powerful people make things happen and weak people make excuses and blame others for their problems. And that's unfortunately the state that we're in, where instead of looking for practical solutions to address these problems, you know, the quote unquote woke people just sit back and blame people and invent conspiracy theories to justify the state of affairs in today's society. That type of mentality will not advance our communities. At the end of the day, we will stay in the same state that we're in right now if we just sit back and blame people, or we sit back and wait and wish and hope and pray for our enemy to give us some reparations. So I just had to express these views, man. I just had enough, with the conditions that exist in our community. And I think that it's time for, instead of people simply fighting the power, just simply marching and stuff like that, it's time for us to seize power in these communities. For people that have progressive ideas, that want to see a difference, that want to see real change. It's time for us to seize power in these communities, us to seize political positions and fundamentally restructure society and restructure the system and how wealth is distributed in these societies and in these cities. Because it's like generation after generation, you had the same condition. Forever, people have been talking about the violence in Baltimore. Forever, people have been talking about the drugs in Baltimore. And it seems like, unfortunately, the elected officials that we have today, not only in Baltimore, but in other cities, they're simply over their head. They simply don't know what the hell they're doing. Because otherwise, you wouldn't have these results that we see in these communities. Instead of cracking down on the problem of drugs, for instance, you got people trying to basically legalize drugs. And we wonder why drugs are proliferating in cities like Baltimore. And I understand the whole arguments in favor of ending the war on drugs, but I'm not necessarily talking about that right now. I'm talking about the state of affairs in our communities, where communities have literally taken over by drug dealers, where people are being terrorized by drug dealers. So much so that the community doesn't have a heart to stand up to these people. So much so that the community is afraid of these people, and they have literally taken over. And you got these elected officials that are essentially giving these drug dealers a green light to continue to plague our communities. You have a revolving door with these violent offenders going in and out of jail and coming back out to continue to terrorize communities. So those are my thoughts. Tell me what you think about this. It's time for us to seize control of our destiny and stop pointing the finger at other people.